This episode of the Quantum Space Innovating Trust podcast is brought to you in association with Vibu Systems, pioneers in software protection, licensing, and long-term digital trust. Quantum computing is no longer theoretical, and it poses a fundamental challenge to today's cryptography. Methods like RSA and ECC will not survive the quantum era. With its next code meter generation, Vibu Systems is already preparing a smooth, compatible transition to post-quantum ready security across hardware, software, and cloud licensing. Discover how CodeMeter is being engineered for the post-quantum future and why preparing early is the only safe strategy. Visit vibu.com/PQC today.
We tend to think of digital infrastructure in terms of what we can see: platforms, cloud services, artificial intelligence, applications, and networks. But the systems that actually determine what is trusted, what is authentic, and what is legally and operationally real sit much deeper and are rarely discussed outside specialist circles. Beneath modern digital life exists a hidden trust layer made up of naming systems, certificate authorities, identity providers, time sources, and cloud control planes. These components don't deliver features, they deliver reality. They decide what systems recognize as valid, who can authenticate, and which events can be proven. When these systems fail, the result is not always dramatic, but it is systemic. In this episode of Innovating Trust, we go beneath the visible digital world to examine what the quantum space calls the invisible stack, the hidden trust infrastructure that underpins modern digital society, and why it is rapidly becoming a strategic security concern. This is Episode 20, The Invisible Stack.
We like to think we live in a digital world built on innovation, on applications, on platforms, on artificial intelligence, on cloud, on speed. We talk about disruption, or we talk about transformation, and we also talk about exponential technologies. But the reality is much less glamorous. The systems that actually make the digital world function, the ones that decide what is real, what is trusted, what is valid, are mostly invisible. Most people never see them. Most organizations barely understand them, and almost nobody talks about them. Yet if these systems fail, entire countries can literally grind to a halt. Not because servers go down, not because networks break, but because the digital world loses the ability to agree on reality. Who is authentic? What is legitimate? Which systems can be trusted? Which transaction really happened? Which record came first? And this hidden layer is what we at the quantum space call the invisible stack. It's the trust substrate of the internet and of modern enterprise systems. And increasingly, it's becoming one of the most strategically important layers of infrastructure on Earth. Act 1. The illusion of stability. From the outside, everything looks resilient. Cloud services scale automatically. Artificial intelligence systems make decisions in milliseconds. Digital identity systems promise frictionless access. Payments move across the planet in seconds, and it feels like the digital world is built on abundance. But underneath that surface is a very small number of foundational systems that everything else quietly depends upon. Systems that were never designed to carry this much power. Systems that were never debated politically. systems that were never treated as national infrastructure. We built digital civilization on top of them anyway, and as long as they work, nobody notices. And that's the paradox of the invisible stack. The more critical it becomes, the less visible it is. What's interesting is that most of these systems were created in a very different era. DNS was designed in the 1980s to connect a few thousand academic hosts. Certificate authorities emerged from academic trust models and early e-commerce experiments. Identity systems were built for internal enterprise directories. Time systems were designed for engineering synchronization, not legal truth. None of them were designed to anchor global digital civilization, and yet today we use them as if they were constitutional infrastructure. We rarely question them, we rarely diagram them, and we very rarely regulate them. And yet they sit underneath everything, silently deciding whether the digital world makes sense. Act 2. When the stack fails. Let's talk about DNS, the Internet's phone book. Every time you type a website address, send an email, use an app, or call an API, something has to translate that name into a real location, and that system is DNS. It doesn't store content, it doesn't move data, it just tells the world where things are. And when DNS fails, the digital world doesn't crash dramatically, it simply disappears. Services don't respond, applications time out, entire platforms become unreachable. And we've seen this repeatedly. In 2020 and again in 2023, Cloudflare suffered DNS-related outages that disrupted large parts of the global internet. Social platforms went offline, APIs failed, authentication systems stopped responding. Nothing was hacked. No malicious actor was involved. A configuration change was enough. Even more striking was the Facebook outage in 2021. A routine routing configuration error effectively removed Facebook from the internet. Not only were users locked out, Facebook's own engineers couldn't access internal systems to fix the problem. A company so large, it couldn't reach itself. And that's why engineers joke, it's always DNS, unless it's not, but it's usually DNS. And it's not funny because it's trivial, it's funny because it is terrifying. DNS is one of the most powerful choke points in modern society, and almost nobody treats it as such. So let's look at certificate authorities. Who decides what is real? If DNS tells you where something is, certificate authorities decide whether it's real. Every time your browser shows a little lock icon, it's trusting a global system of certificate authorities to confirm that the website you're talking to is legitimate. There are only a few hundred of these authorities worldwide, and the tiny subset of them effectively anchors trust for the entire internet. One of the most famous failures was DigiNotar, a Dutch certificate authority. In 2011, attackers compromised DigiNotar and issued fake certificates for major services, including Google. These certificates were used to spy on users, particularly in Iran. When the web breach was discovered, browsers revoked trust in DigiNotar entirely. The company collapsed. The Dutch government had to intervene, and for a brief moment, the global trust system visibly cracked. Nothing dramatic happened on screen, no lights went out, but millions of users were suddenly interacting with a reality that was no longer verifiably real. More recently, there have been multiple incidents of misissued certificates created for domains without proper authorization. In most cases, nothing catastrophic happens, but the structural reality is uncomfortable. A very small number of organizations quietly decide what the entire world is allowed to trust. And as automation has increased, systems like Let's Encrypt Now issue the majority of certificates on the internet. We fixed trust at scale by centralizing it, which is an extraordinary sentence if you stop to think about it. And let's talk about identity providers. These are the gatekeepers of reality. So this is our next layer, identity. Increasingly, individuals and companies no longer manage their own authentication systems. They rely on central identity providers, Microsoft, Google, Apple, cloud-based identity platforms. So these systems now decide who can log in, who can work, who can access services, who can transact. When Microsoft's identity systems have suffered outages, enterprises around the world have been locked out of their own environments. Employees unable to work, administrators unable to fix systems, entire organizations frozen. And similar incidents have occurred with Google's identity infrastructure, where developers and system owners lost access to cloud environments they themselves were responsible for operating. If your identity provider fails, you don't just lose convenience, you lose existence. You can't authenticate, you can't authorize, and you can't prove who you are to the systems that run your life. Identity providers are quietly becoming private ministries of digital interior without ever being treated as such. And now let's talk about time, this hidden axis of trust, because it's one of the strangest components of the invisible stack. Every digital system depends on knowing what happened first, which transaction came before another, which log entry is authoritative, which signature is valid, which event can be proven. Without trusted time, audit collapses, forensics collapses, legal accountability collapses. Financial systems have experienced failures simply because clocks drifted out of sync, transactions rejected, reports invalid, investigations unable to establish order. Much of modern infrastructure depends on satellite-based time sources such as GPS. And if these signals are disrupted, spoofed, or degraded, entire systems lose their ability to agree on reality. We built global truth on top of a few clocks in space, and rarely asked what happens if these clocks become unreliable. And then there's cloud control planes, the new single points of failure. Because these are the biggest invisible dependency of all, these cloud control planes. We talk about the cloud as if it's a distributed abstraction. In reality, it's a small number of highly centralized systems that orchestrate enormous parts of global infrastructure. Banking, healthcare, government services, artificial intelligence platforms, enterprise IT. And when UWS's US East 1 region, often described as the most important region on Earth, has suffered outages, the impact has rippled across thousands of companies. Not because their servers failed, but because the control system that managed the cloud lost coherence. Companies discovered dependency they didn't know they had. Systems failed that nobody thought were connected, and entire business models paused. We centralized digital civilization and called it efficiency. Act 3, the war angle. Now comes the uncomfortable part. If you wanted to destabilize a modern country, you wouldn't start with missiles or tanks. You would start with the invisible stack, not by destroying infrastructure, but by poisoning trust. Break DNS and regions lose coordination. Compromise certificates and legitimacy collapses. Disrupt identity and citizens disappear digitally. Undermine time and truth becomes legally ambiguous. And interfere with cloud control planes and institutions fail silently. And this is the perfect terrain for modern conflict. These systems are hard to attribute, easy to disguise as accidents, massively centralized, and politically under-theorized. They sit in that gray zone between technical failure and strategic attack. And that's exactly where hostile actors prefer to operate. Modern defense strategies already reflect this. Cyber operations are no longer framed as support functions. They are strategic domains. It's not about stealing data. It's not about defacing websites. It's about attacking the system that decides what is valid, trusted, and real. In other words, the weaponization of trust infrastructure. The invisible stack isn't broken, but it is fragile. More importantly, it is largely invisible in public debate. We regulate content, we regulate platforms, and we regulate data, but we ever barely talk about who controls trust, who anchors legitimacy, who operates the foundations of digital reality. We built a digital world obsessed with innovation, and we forgot to understand the system that makes it possible to trust anything at all. And that's the invisible stack. And in the coming years, it may matter more than any single technology we're currently arguing about.
You've been listening to the Quantum Space Podcast, exploring the technologies and trust infrastructures that underpin digital systems, identity, security, and post-quantum resilience. If this episode on the invisible stack has sharpened your view of how digital trust really works, you can find deeper analysis, expert interviews, and long-form research at thequantumspace.org. We publish ongoing coverage across sovereign AI, digital identity, post-quantum cryptography, and critical trust infrastructure, focusing on the operational layers most people never see, but everyone depends on. Follow the podcast for upcoming episodes and extended deep dives into the systems that make digital trust possible and fragile.
This was Innovating Trust, a Quantum Space podcast edited and produced by Crown Communications.